Hi guys, so you're probably excited to start putting together your Joule Thief solar lamp. So before you start, it's always important to just kind of take stock of your safety. You should have a pair of safety glasses, put them on your face. Your workspace should be free of anything flammable or anything that you're going to knock over. You should have room to move your elbows. It's helpful to make sure you have all your supplies out in front of you so you don't have to get up and get anything. Have a pair of wire strippers. Also helpful but not mandatory is to have a separate pair of wire cutters, but you can use the wire strippers inside blade as a wire cutter. Have your solder. Have your soldering iron turned on. I recommend turning it on to about 750. That's a good temperature to melt the lead-free solder. So now that we've got everything here, I'm just going to orient you with the circuit board a little bit here. So I've already soldered on your JST connectors, but this presents a little bit of a hazard. You'll notice some of the solder pads are really close to the plastic on those JST connectors, so be really careful when you're soldering near them. You want to make sure you don't hit the plastic connectors with your soldering iron and accidentally melt them, otherwise your connectors may not plug in. So the first thing I like to solder on is just the LEDs. It's a good introduction to learning how to solder and kind of gets you started. So the LEDs, it's important to know that electricity only flows through an LED in one direction. And you'll notice that the LED has a long leg and a short leg. You can see it right there. The long leg will go through the square holes on the board. So long leg, square hole. The short leg goes through the round hole. So I recommend plugging in a few LEDs at a time and say to yourself each time, long leg, square hole. Long leg, square hole. Okay, long leg, square hole. And I'll just do 3 at first, and then I'll solder the rest down in just a moment. After you've got a few LEDs plugged in, make sure you're plugging them into the marked places that say LED, long leg, square hole, remember. And then flip your board over while holding those LEDs in place. And if you bend the legs of the LEDs just a little, they'll stay in place while you solder them on. And notice this one, of course, is pretty close to that JST connector, so you want to be super careful not to bump it while you're soldering. Okay, next you're ready to solder. And you can use a helping hand, but I'm not going to use one just to show you how to do it without a helping hand if you need to. Just rest the board. You're going to put the LEDs through on the top side where the silk screen is, so the legs are coming through the bottom side, and just rest it on a flat surface there. And then to solder, the important thing to remember is that solder won't flow over parts that are cold, so you have to make sure you heat up the parts. Then you're going to melt the solder onto them, and then you're going to take the soldering iron away. So I'm going to move this board a little bit so I'm less likely to hit those JST connectors, and I'll start from the one closest to the JST connector to get it over with. So you hold the soldering iron on the leg and the solder pad at the same time. Hold it there for about 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Melt a little solder on. Take the solder away, take the iron away. You should see a little like kind of volcano shape of solder that flows over both of the leg and the hole. Okay, then you're going to do the other pad. 1, 2, 3, melt, take it away. Okay, and I'll hold that up so you can see what it looks like. So the solder, when done correctly, flows over the pad and the leg, and you don't see any bare spots. You should be able to wiggle it and it doesn't move. So that looks pretty good. Also, make sure you don't have a bridge connecting the two legs. A bridge anywhere on these LEDs will make a short circuit and your lights will not light up at all. None of them will light up. 1, 2, 3. Okay, next one. They're a little tricky to get to sometimes. 1, 2, 3. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Don't worry about a little smoke coming up. The solder has a little bit of an acid inside the core of it, and the acid helps to keep the tip of your soldering iron nice and clean. So when the acid burns off, it makes a little smoke. It's not toxic. It's just like a little liquid boiling off. So just double check and make sure you have no bridges between the legs of your LEDs, and that the solder is flowing nicely over the leg and also over the solder pad. And once you've got those soldered on, you can take your wire cutters and just cut the legs off. Try to cut them off in a way that that leg isn't like going to go flying like that one just did. So one possible tip is to kind of hold the leg in place while you're cutting, so then it doesn't go flying off and hurt somebody or get in your eyes. But you should be wearing your safety glasses, so hopefully it doesn't get in your eyes anyway. I can just tell you it's very painful to step on an LED leg, so you don't want them to go on the carpet. Okay, that's those three. Next, I'll let you go ahead and put in the rest of them. Remember, long leg, square hole all the way around, and you can solder those in place, and I'll see you for the next step. All right, now all of my LEDs are soldered on, and just do a quick inspection before you move on to the next part. You want to make sure all of your LED solder pads are separate from each other and there's no solder bridging the legs together. You also should just think in your mind and make sure you put the long leg in the square hole. If you flip an LED around and put the long leg through the wrong hole, one LED won't light up. If you have any solder bridges anywhere on here, then nothing will light up and you'll know pretty quickly. If you do see a solder bridge, a quick way to clear it is to just take your soldering iron and kind of swipe in between the legs of the LED, and usually that clears it up. Okay? So the next part, since this is one of the harder ones, we'll do this next, is the Ferrite Toroid. So the Ferrite Toroid has to have two wires that are going around it in opposite directions. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our two colored wires, make sure they're two different colors, and we're going to wrap them around the same direction, but then we're going to wire them up opposite of each other so the current flows through them opposite. Start by putting your wires through the toroid, and you want to leave a little tail on the end, like 1.5 inches. And then you're going to take the other end and wrap it back through the toroid. Oops, so it's a little tricky to do on camera, but wrap it through. Again, you want about 1.5 inches of tail there. There you go. And then you're going to wrap around again. And you keep doing this over and over again. I'm going to try to untangle them as I go, but it really doesn't matter if they're a little twisted. The circuit's pretty forgiving and it can handle a few twists along the way. I think it looks neater if they're laid nice next to each other, but it won't affect the integrity of the circuit if there are a few twists in your wires. So just wrap them around and around, over and over, all the way around, and you're going to keep doing this until you either run out of wire or you've gone all the way around the toroid. So I'm getting close. Maybe 1 or 2 more loops and then I should be good. Let's see if I can get one more out of this. All right. Yep, that works. Okay, so then you end up with your toroid and you have the wire sticking out of either side, right? So now I'm going to take some wire cutters and cut them so they're all the same length. Okay. And you still want to have enough that you've got a little wiggle room there. And then I'm going to strip the wires so that there's enough that I can solder to the board. So this is 22 gauge wire. So I recommend starting with the slot that says 20, but if that doesn't strip the casing off, move to the one that says 22. And you don't need to strip off too much, just like maybe, 0.5 centimeter, enough that you can poke it through the circuit board, but you don't want to leave an excessive amount of bare wire. Okay, whoops, I accidentally snipped instead of stripping the casing off. There we go. So next comes the hard part. This is where most people get confused and something that can cause your board not to light up at all. Notice on your circuit board, there's these little like spirally markings, and there's letter A on 2 of them and letter B on 2 of them. So you're going to assign, you have 2 colored wires. You're going to assign one color to be A and one color to be B. So I might say on mine that the blue is A and the yellow is B. Now I'm going to put the toroid on the underside of my board because that way it won't get in the way of the lights. So I just want to find which are the holes that are marked A and B. And start off by doing the A wires. So mine are blue. I'm going to put both the blue through A and A, and then verify on this side that they're going through A. But before you put the yellow ones through B, so I've got the yellow ones right here. These are my B wires. Cross them. Make an X. Okay? So then after you've crossed them and you made an X, then you can put those through the B slots, B and B. And I can feel the heat of my soldering iron, be very aware of it. You don't want to, ugh, having a little trouble squeezing that in there, but I will get it. There we go. Okay, so when you look at it edge on, I can see the blue wires are going in on the proper sides of the toroid, but the yellow wires make an X. Okay, that's really important. Blue wires are both in A and yellow wires are both in B. I'm going to bend the wires down just enough that they stay in place, and then I will solder those on. So just do a quick double check. One color should be in the A's, coming out the correct sides of the toroid. One color should be in the B's, and it makes an X. Okay, if you've got that, you are ready to solder those wires in place. So I'll just kind of prop my board on its side like this. And I'm going to be very careful not to melt anything else on the board. So be really precise with my placements here. Oops, didn't quite get that. See, it won't flow if you don't get the wire and the solder pad nice and hot. So, and once you've soldered these on, just like you did with the lights, you're going to give everything a little bit of a wiggle. And if it doesn't wiggle in its slot, then you've soldered it on correctly. Whoopsie, I didn't get the solder on the pad, not hot enough. You have to get the wire and the solder pad nice and hot for the solder to flow onto it. And there we go. And then I'm just going to take my wire cutters and give it a little haircut so everything lays nice and flat and I don't have too many pokey parts coming out that can poke. All right, so now we're ready to move on to the next step. The next step will be to do the resistor and the diode. Now, if you look on your board, you can see there's a rectangle that has an R and a rectangle that has a D. And the rectangle that has a D has like a band going across one side, a little stripe. So your resistor and your diode kind of look like the same shape that they are on the board. Now, the diode that I've sent you is a little transparent red thing. It's small, and it has a black band on one side. Okay, so that my diode's really hard to see. Let me put it up next to the board so you can kind of see it there. All right, that's the diode. Small little thing, transparent red, black band. So for the diode, we're going to bend the legs so they kind of make like an upside down U. Okay, and then look for the rectangle that has a D. And you're going to put the diode in the holes on either side of the D, but make sure the black band on the diode is oriented the same way as the stripe on the circuit board. That's really important. Diodes are one-way circuit components. Electricity only flows through them one way. So the diode goes in its proper slot, the black band lining up with the stripe. Okay. The resistor is kind of barrel-shaped and it has multiple colored stripes. The one that I gave you is brown, black, red. And do the same thing, bend it like a little upside down U. The resistor is not directional. You can put it in either way. It doesn't matter. Just find the rectangle that says R, and you're going to put the legs of the resistor on either side of the rectangle that says R. Okay? You can put these on the top of the board. That's fine. And here's the part where you really need to be careful. The diode's one leg is extremely close to this one JST connector, and you don't want to burn it. So we're going to be really careful soldering that so we don't accidentally melt the plastic on the JST connector. Okay, let me move my wire cutters out of the way, and we'll solder those on. Okay, see, I was really careful. I didn't touch the JST connector. It's still there. Didn't melt it. This one's a little sketchy too. It's right next to the other JST, so I'm approaching it from this side, so it doesn't melt. Okay, and one more. This is right next to the Ferrite Toroid. Don't forget it. There we go. And then we'll nip the legs off there. I'll kind of hold them while I cut so they don't go flying. Okay, and we are ready to go on to our last circuit board component, and that's the transistor. So the transistor is this little component. If you look at the top of it, it's kind of shaped like a D. And if you look at your circuit board, there's the marking NPN, and then you'll see a curved marking on it. So it matches the curve of the transistor. It is very important that this is oriented the right way. So you'll just kind of bend the legs apart just a little bit so that they'll fit in the holes that are marked there. Okay, and make sure that the curve of the transistor is lined up with the curve on the circuit board. And you put the 3 legs in the 3 slots there. push it down, but you don't need to push it down all the way. It's okay if it sticks up just a bit. It should stick up just about as high as the LEDs, and that's fine. Bend the legs down just a little, and you can solder those on. Once again, being extremely careful of that one JST connector. You don't want to melt it. So I'm going to try to approach the transistor from this side of the leg so I don't accidentally melt that plastic. Whoops, oh, I touched it, see? Gosh, you got to be super careful here. It didn't melt though. Just nicked it. Okay, so there we go. The circuit board is now complete, and we'll cut those legs off. And that's all the components that go on the circuit board. Okay, so you can set that aside for now. And if you want, you can kind of take the Ferrite Toroid and just sort of fold it so it's, you know, sort of a low profile underneath the board. We'll come back to that in a moment. But for now, we're going to solder a couple other components. So we need to take care of the battery holder, the solar panel, and the switch. Now for the battery holder, we're going to solder that to one of these 2-pin JST connectors. So you get the 2-pin JST connector with little red and black wires, and a battery holder with red and black wires. And we are going to solder red to red and black to black. I prefer to cut these wires down a little bit. I don't want the ends to accidentally touch each other and make a short circuit. So I like to trim them so they're so short they can't possibly touch each other. So this part's a little tricky because I find stripping stranded wire to be like a little rough. But you'll cut the red wire, and I would say strip this one with the 22 gauge slot and see how that treats you. You should see a few strands of wire if you did it right. You be careful, if you tug too hard, you can end up, you know, tearing apart all the wires inside there. There we go. And then we'll do the same thing with the black. Cut it pretty close to the battery holder. And then I'm going to strip the wire with the 22 gauge slot. And you can see the little strands of wire inside. And then we'll do the same thing to the JST connector. So I'll strip that wire just a little bit more so I've got some wire to connect to my battery holder. Okay, now you're going to do black to black and red to red. So hook your wires over each other. I just kind of make like a hook shape with one and a hook shape with the other. Okay, I don't know if you can see that super well. And then once they're resting next to each other, I'm going to solder them together. Try not to solder this directly on like a table or something. If you actually want to clip them into a helping hand or even put them in a pie tin or something, that might help so that you don't accidentally burn your table. I've got this little silicone mat, so it's a pretty safe place to solder. When you solder these together, you may find that you melt a little bit of the wire casing, and that's okay. It might be a little stinky, but it's not going to hurt anything. Okay, so black to black, and then we'll do the same thing with red to red. Don't put the battery in just yet. You want to do this on a empty battery holder. Okay, so now those two are hooked over each other, and I'll just solder them together. All right. So now I've got my battery holder connected, and you just kind of want to make sure those wires don't touch each other. But one thing you can do is just get a little electrical tape. I've got some back here. And I'll just kind of tape a flap of tape over those bare spots in the wire just so they don't cause me any short circuits later. You can also use heat shrink like before you solder this, just to make sure that those don't contact anything on your board and short anything out. So let me get my scissors so I can cut the electrical tape. Always something, one piece, two pieces, and we'll just take the tape and just make a little flap over those bare wires so they don't short anything out. Okay, perfect. Next is the solar panel. So before we connect anything to the circuit board, we'll just solder all these components together. You can peel the plastic off of the solar panel. That doesn't hurt anything. And on the back of the solar panel, you'll see there's a plus pad and a minus pad. And I'll hold this up to the camera so you can see it maybe. A little hard to see because of the light. There you go, a plus pad and a minus pad. So there's a tinned pad here that's already soldered, and this one's connected to the minus. and a tinned pad that's connected to the plus. But I actually prefer to solder the wires onto these non-tinned pads, the ones that are closer to the center, because then it makes it easier to put the solar panel on the outside of my lamp case. So before I solder the wires on, I'm going to tin those pads a little bit just by melting a little solder on the copper pad. So you hold the soldering iron on those copper pads, the plus and the minus, and just melt a little solder onto them. So now they're tinned, okay? And then to solder the JST connector, you're going to get your second 2-pin JST connector. It's got a red and a black wire, and the red will go to the plus and the black to the minus. And if you don't feel like that's quite enough wire sticking out to solder to, you can use that 22 gauge slot and you can strip off a little more of the casing. So red to plus, black to minus. Now that you've got it tinned, you can sort of hold the wire on that little puddle of solder. And if you're very still and you hold it very carefully, you can just melt it, rest the wire in it, and it sort of solidifies in the solder, okay? Easy peasy. Gotta hold very still though. You don't want to be wiggling it around while it's cooling. Okay, perfect. So plus and minus. And once again, just to kind of hold it in place, if you have a little electrical tape or any kind of tape, you can just tape those down just to provide a little strain relief so they don't pull free as you're messing with everything and putting it in the case. Okay, solar panel is good. Next is the switch. Now our switch has 3 pins on it, and we have one remaining JST connector. It's a 3-pin JST connector with 3 wires. These 3 wires, there's a yellow, red, and black, and the black wire is in the middle. It's most important that the black wire, that middle wire, goes to the middle pin on your switch. And the other 2 wires, it doesn't really matter, but the middle wire is super important that it goes in the right place. So I'm going to strip the wires just a little bit using that 22 gauge slot so that I've got a little more to solder onto. This part I find actually kind of tricky. If you have some heat shrink, you could put the heat shrink on now so you can slide it over when you're done. But I actually use a little hot glue instead of heat shrink, so I'll show you how to do that. So black wire, middle pin. Slide the black wire through that lug on the middle pin, and you're going to bend it over so it kind of makes a hook. And then rest it there and make sure it's nice and steady. And you're going to solder. Make sure you heat up the lugs and the wire together so that the solder really flows over both. It's a little tricky to get it to stay in place if you're not using a helping hand, but it can be done. All right. So now you've got a nice flow of solder over that wire and the pad. Looks nice. And for the red and the yellow, they can just go on the 2 outside lugs. It doesn't really matter which is which. Okay. There's the red. And I like to make sure the solder flows like over the hole in the lug so that the wire's really anchored in place good. Be careful of making the soldering iron come into sustained contact with the plastic. You don't want to melt your switch. Okay, and then the yellow wire, that's going to go on the other outside pin. And I don't want to connect the metal to each other. I just want to connect the wire to the lug on the switch. Okay. And if it's all good, then you should see those wires are connected very firmly. Now, I'm not gonna, it'll take me a minute to get the hot glue gun heated up, but I just take a little hot glue and flow it over the whole assembly. It'll insulate those wires from each other and prevent any fuzzies from getting in contact with each other, and that'll really help you as you're finishing up with the assembly. So I'll pause there to do a little hot glue, and then we'll come back to finish putting the lamp together. All right, we are ready to begin final assembly, and so I'm going to do the hot gluing as part of this, but I'm going to test everything out before I finish the assembly just to make sure it all worked. So to do the final assembly, just do a quick double check on your circuit board and make sure all of the solder pads are distinct from each other and none of them are in contact with each other. Make sure they all look like they're flowing smoothly over the leg and the solder pad, and you don't have any like weird crackly looking solder. So okay, The way that you plug the JST connectors in is you're going to look on the front of the board, and there's a place where it says SP plus minus. SP stands for solar panel. So you find your solar panel with its JST connector, flip your board over and find the corresponding JST connector for that one, and you're going to plug the solar panel into that part where it says SP. It should only plug in one way. There's a notch on the male connector that lines up with a fin on the female connector. Okay, and the solar panel's connected. Next, you're going to find the battery, and there's a little thing that says BAT plus minus on the board, and it's a 2-pin connector. So you find the corresponding place on the back of the board, and you'll plug the battery in. Okay, and then you'll see switch on the board, and you're going to plug the switch into that connector. Okay, then just to do a test before we assemble everything into the case, take your battery, it's time, and you're going to plug it in so that the flat end, the minus end, goes toward the spring. Flat end, spring. Okay, and if all went well, if you flip the switch one way, you should see your board light up. Hey, there we go. So the way your circuit works is that flipping the switch one way is light, and in the center it does nothing. Flipping it the other way, you won't see any indicator, but it's charging. The solar panel can charge the battery when the switch is flipped the other way. So now that we know which way it is to light up, then we can make sure we mark that on the case when we assemble it. Okay, we're ready to put everything in the case. Now that I know the switch works, I'm going to take my hot glue, and I'm just going to spread a little hot glue over those 3 pins. Kind of keeps them separate from each other and makes it so that no fuzzies from the wires are going to come into contact with each other. So it's kind of the same idea as heat shrink. It's just a little, maybe more low tech. There we go. Got the hot glue on there. Okay. Be careful not to touch the hot glue until it's cool. I can pull these little stringies off, but I definitely don't want to touch the blobs of hot glue. If you've ever done that before, you know it burns like crazy. All right, to assemble it inside the case, you probably have one of these 3D printed cases here. If I've forgotten, there may be a little mesh inside that little hole for the switch, so you can just take wire cutters and you can pull that mesh out. I tried to take care of it for you, but I may have forgotten on a couple, so we'll pull that mesh out. Okay, and the way this works is the light's going to shine out the big open side, the solar panel goes here, and the switch is going to come out the small hole. So I'll start by taking the solar panel and I'll just feed it through the small hole, and I want to have it kind of resting over, resting over the small hole there. And just to keep it in place, you can do a bead of hot glue around the edge of that hole and then press the solar panel down. So before we assemble everything in there, let's go ahead and it needs to be kind of thin. Don't want to do too much hot glue. I like doing hot glue here instead of super glue. It's a little easier to pick off if I need to disassemble something to fix it later. So it's just my preferred method. Okay, but be careful, it's hot. All right, and press it down, and you'll just leave it there until it cures. There we go. Don't burn yourself. I almost did. Okay. Solar panel is complete. So next we're going to try to stuff the rest of this in this circuit board. So I'll put the battery in, and I kind of put the battery off to one side. I'm going to go ahead and put the switch through the hole. Oh, I smeared up my hot glue a little bit. That's fun. I'll put the switch through. So the way the switch works, this is really cool. The switch has a nut and a washer, and then a washer and another nut. You might need a pair of pliers to loosen that little washer on top, or loosen the nut. So you take the top nut off. You take the top washer off, but leave the second washer on. So there's 2 washers. You just want to pull one of them off. Leave the other washer on there. And then you're going to put that through the hole on the case. Okay, and then line it up in there. Make sure you like how it's resting. And then you'll replace the washer and the nut. So washer and then the nut. Hold the switch while you're getting it tightened on there. And you might want to use pliers to ratchet it down a little. and it holds it in place very nicely. It's mostly weatherproof. All right, for our last step, now that we've got the switch installed and everything's in order, all that's left to do is stuff everything into the case and put the lens on. So stuffing it into the case is a little tricky. It's very tight, and it's intended to be tight so things don't shake around and come disconnected. So you'll need to kind of put the battery in like off to the side, and then make sure that the toroid is kind of folded underneath the board, and you'll stuff the wires underneath the board as best as you can. Remember, the lights need to be pointing up so they shine out. There you go. And so it may take a couple of tries before you get everything to be placed correctly, but it's right if you can get the board to be flush with the top. You need to be able to put the lens on top without it being levitated over the top of the board. So arranging the battery is the trickiest part. It seems like one of those JST connectors is always kind of in the way. So, but if you can wrangle it a little bit, there you go. And then to put the lens on, I've got one right here that's laser cut. Yours probably came with paper on the top and the bottom. So you are going to need to peel that paper off. It's just a sticker. It's just kind of hard to get a nail under so that you can peel the paper off. But this acrylic really cuts beautifully on the laser cutter, and it's nice and clear and just makes a wonderful lens on your lantern. So there we go. And so then we're going to take some super glue. We're ready for this. Make sure it's going to fit on there. All right, so make sure, put it on top, make sure everything lays down flat and it looks good. Flip the switch, make sure it still lights up. Okay, and as long as everything is good there, you're going to just do a thin bead of super glue around the outside edge. Be really careful not to get this on your hands, and you don't want to overdo it with the super glue, because if the lens slips around on the super glue and you get too much on the lens, it's going to make your lens cloudy, and you don't want that. So just make it real thin. It doesn't have to be super watertight. Nobody's going to be going swimming with it, but you want it to stay on. Okay. Put the cap back on before I put the lens on and let it cure. Okay, and try not to let it slide around too much. I've got it a little bit off kilter, and I just got super glue on my finger and it's sliding, and that's not good. Lens is going to be cloudy. So yeah, if you get super glue on your finger, don't touch your finger to anything else. You're going to let it dry there, and then you're going to get a little nail polish remover, and you're going to wipe it off after it dries. But don't touch anything. Just let it sit there. You'll have to hold the lens down until it cures completely. Mine is going to end up curing a little bit cloudy because I did smear a little super glue on the inside. It's not devastating. It's just not going to be as pretty as it would have been. So once you've got that set, flip the switch so that it lights up, and then you'll want to take a Sharpie and label the side that lights up with an L and label the other side with a C. The light won't charge while it's lit up, and it won't charge while that switch is in the middle position. It only charges when it's flipped over to the side opposite the side it lights up. And then when it's in the charge position, you can flip it over and expose the solar panel to the sun, and your light will light. So that is your tutorial on making your Joule Thief solar lamp. I'm excited to get these. I know that people are really going to find them valuable. And hopefully you learned some things about electronics and soldering and doing good quality work in the process. Okay? See ya.